Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam, February 23, 1966. 0400 hours, Sergeant Bob Condon pressed himself against the wet bark of a rubber tree, every muscle frozen. 20 meters ahead, a Viet Cong soldier squatted beside the trail, his AK-47 resting across his knees. The VC couldn't see the 5 Australian SAS operators who had tracked his unit for the past 17 hours. He couldn't hear their breathing, masked by the constant drip of morning condensation. He had no idea that death was watching him through the dim pre-dawn light. Condon's patrol, 5 men against what intelligence suggested was a full VC battalion of 300 fighters, had been following this enemy force since yesterday morning. No air support, no artillery on standby, no quick reaction force waiting to extract them if things went wrong. Just 5 Australians, their suppressed weapons, and a mission that seemed designed to get them killed. Track the enemy, identify their base camp, and call in coordinates for a strike. The VC soldier stood, stretched, and walked down the trail. Condon's finger relaxed on his trigger. Not yet. The Australian SAS had learned something in Borneo that the Americans were still figuring out in 1966. In this kind of war, the side that shot first often lost. Patience wasn't just a virtue. It was survival. What Condon didn't know, crouched in that rubber plantation as the sky lightened, was that his patrol's 48-hour hunt would rewrite the tactical playbook for the entire war. The Americans had 180,000 troops in Vietnam, deploying massive search and destroy operations with thousands of soldiers. The Australians had 4,500 men total, and they were about to prove that a different way of fighting could be devastatingly more effective. When the first Australian task force arrived in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966, American commanders were politely skeptical. The Australians brought 4,500 soldiers to a war where the Americans were deploying divisions. They insisted on operating independently in their own tactical area of responsibility, and they had peculiar ideas about how to fight. The Yanks thought we were crazy, recalled Warrant Officer Reg Beasley, SAS Squadron. They'd send companies out on search and destroy missions, making enough noise to wake the dead. We'd send 5-man patrols who'd spend 3 days tracking a single enemy platoon. The Australian approach originated from hard lessons learned in the Malayan Emergency, 1948-1960, and Borneo Confrontation, 1962-1966. While American doctrine emphasized firepower and attrition, the Australians had developed what they called find, fix, and strike tactics. The difference was profound. Americans searched for the enemy to destroy them immediately. Australians tracked the enemy to understand them first, then destroyed them decisively. We weren't interested in body counts, explained Major Brian Wade, who commanded several SAS operations in 1966. We wanted to know where the enemy lived, how they moved, where they got their supplies. You can't kill an organization by shooting individual soldiers. You kill it by destroying its infrastructure. The SAS, Australian Special Air Service Regiment, epitomized this philosophy. Formed in 1957 and modeled after the British SAS, these soldiers underwent selection processes so brutal that 80% of volunteers failed. Those who passed learned tracking, survival, silent killing, and most importantly, patience. Each SAS patrol consisted of 5 men: patrol commander, medic, signaler, and 2 scouts. They carried 7 days of rations, minimal ammunition, and radio equipment. No grenades, too loud. No laws or heavy weapons, too heavy. Just suppressed rifles, survival skills, and an uncanny ability to move through jungle without leaving a trace. American officers initially viewed this as quaint. General William Westmoreland's strategy relied on large unit operations. Companies, battalions, even entire divisions sweeping through suspected enemy areas. The body count was the metric that mattered. More kills meant progress. The Australians saw the flaw immediately. You can't kill your way to victory against an enemy who doesn't care about casualties, noted Lieutenant Colonel David Thompson, commander of the SAS squadron. The VC would trade 10 lives for one of ours and consider it a bargain. You had to make them afraid to operate, period. By early 1966, the Americans had been fighting in Vietnam for over a year with mixed results. Large operations killed hundreds of VC but rarely secured lasting control of territory. The enemy simply vanished, waited, and returned. The Australian SAS proposed a different experiment. What if you could track the enemy so effectively they couldn't hide? What if you turned the hunters into the hunted? The Australian approach to Vietnam grew from a decade of jungle warfare experience that most American units lacked. In Malaya, Australian and British forces had defeated a communist insurgency by mastering the environment rather than overwhelming it with firepower. Malaya taught us that the jungle wasn't the enemy. It was a tool, explained Sergeant Terry O'Farrell, who served in both conflicts. Learn to move through it silently, and you own it. The enemy becomes blind while you can see everything. The SAS squadron that deployed to Vietnam in 1966 brought these lessons as doctrine. Their training regime was exhaustive. 6-month selection courses where candidates navigated jungle terrain for weeks with minimal rations, practiced tracking until they could identify individual enemy soldiers by their footprints, and learned to remain concealed mere meters from enemy patrols. The 5-man patrol structure itself was revolutionary. American squads typically numbered 10 to 12 men. Enough firepower to fight, but too many for true stealth. The Australians calculated that 5 was the optimal number. Small enough to remain undetected, large enough to survive brief contact, and perfectly sized for the tactical flexibility required in close quarters tracking. Each patrol member had specialized skills. The commander made tactical decisions and handled mission planning. The medic carried medical supplies that could sustain the patrol for a week without resupply. The signaler maintained communications with base, critical when you were 20 kilometers deep in enemy territory. The 2 scouts, typically the most experienced soldiers, read the jungle like a language. Broken branches meant enemy movement. Disturbed leaf litter indicated how many passed and when. The smell of cooking fires or cigarettes revealed enemy positions. Their weapons reflected this philosophy. While American infantry carried M16 rifles firing at 700 to 900 rounds per minute, SAS patrols used suppressed weapons, modified rifles that reduced muzzle reports to barely audible whispers. They fired single shots only, aimed with obsessive precision. You don't spray and pray when you're outnumbered 50 to 1, noted Corporal Peter Doc Kelly, patrol medic. Every shot has to count, and every shot has to be silent. By February 1966, the SAS squadron had conducted preliminary reconnaissance patrols around their base at Nui Dat. These initial missions established protocols that would define their operations for the rest of the war. Absolute noise discipline, hand signals only, no speaking. Minimal equipment, everything that rattled or reflected light was taped or removed. And patience above all else. The first major operation came when intelligence reported a large VC force operating near the Hot Dish Corridor, a known enemy infiltration route. Previous American operations had swept through the area with battalion-strength forces, found nothing, and withdrawn. The Australians decided to try something different. Send a single 5-man patrol to track the VC for as long as necessary, no matter where they went or how long it took. February 20, 1966, 0600 hours, Sergeant Condon's patrol inserted by helicopter into a clearing 8 kilometers from the suspected VC location. Within minutes of the Huey's departure, they had vanished into the jungle. 5 men moving in single file, 10 meters apart, each step placed deliberately to avoid snapping twigs or rustling vegetation. By mid-morning, they found the trail, a footpath beaten down by hundreds of feet, fresh enough that Condon could see where mud hadn't yet dried in deeper impressions. "We counted boot prints for 20 minutes, he recalled years later. Different tread patterns, different sizes. This wasn't a platoon, this was a battalion on the move. The patrol followed, not on the trail itself, that was suicide, but parallel to it, moving through jungles so thick they sometimes covered only 500 meters in an hour. Scout Bob "Smoky" Dawson led, reading the trail while simultaneously scanning for ambushes. Behind him, the patrol moved like ghosts. At 1400 hours, they heard voices. Dawson's raised fist froze the patrol instantly. Ahead, through gaps in foliage, they could see a VC rest area. 30 to 40 soldiers lying in hammocks, cleaning weapons, cooking rice. The patrol melted into the undergrowth and waited. For 3 hours, they watched from 15 meters away, close enough to hear conversations, noting unit insignia and weapons types. As dusk approached, the VC force assembled and moved north. The patrol followed. Night tracking is among the most difficult military skills. You can't use flashlights. You can't move quickly. Every sense strains to maintain contact without revealing your position. The SAS soldiers had trained for this in Australia's harshest terrain, but training never fully prepared you for tracking 300 armed enemy soldiers through pitch-black jungle. "You followed by sound, mostly," explained Dawson. The clink of equipment, voices calling to each other, the smell of cigarettes. Sometimes you got so close you could reach out and touch the last man in their column. You had to trust your mates behind you were tracking you the same way. At 2300 hours, the VC force stopped. Condon's patrol heard the sounds of a camp being established. Sentries posted, fighting positions dug, equipment stored. The patrol found a position 100 meters away, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid detection, and settled in for the night. They took turns on watch in 2-hour rotations. No one slept deeply. At any moment, a wandering VC sentry could stumble onto them. At 300 hours, Corporal Tim Fisher, on watch, heard footsteps approaching. A VC soldier walked within 3 meters of their position, urinated, and walked back. Fisher never moved, barely breathed. The VC never knew. February 23, 1966. Dawn. As light returned, the patrol faced a critical decision. Intelligence wanted the VC base camp location for an airstrike. But the enemy was now deep in their own territory, probably near their main base. Following further meant potentially walking into an area where hundreds more VC operated. Condon made the call, they would continue. The VC moved at dawn, and the patrol followed. Now the tracking became surreal. They were stalking a force that outnumbered them 60 to 1 in the enemy's backyard, with no support available. If discovered, they would die in seconds. Yet the alternative, losing contact after coming this far, was unacceptable. At 1000 hours, the VC column entered a large rubber plantation. The patrol followed into the geometric rows of trees, a landscape that provided both concealment and terrifying exposure. They could see further, but so could the enemy. That's when things went wrong. The VC column suddenly stopped. A command echoed through the plantation, sharp, urgent. Enemy soldiers began spreading out, moving perpendicular to their previous route. Someone had spotted something. Were they looking for the patrol? Condon signaled immediate halt. The 5 Australians froze in place, using the rubber trees for cover. 60 meters ahead, VC soldiers moved through the plantation in a loose search pattern. If they continued in their current direction, they would walk right past the patrol's position. The SAS soldiers had 3 choices: break contact and run, certain detection; open fire, suicide against those numbers; or remain frozen and pray the search passed them by. They chose option 3. For 20 minutes, the patrol didn't move. VC soldiers passed within 20 meters, calling to each other, weapons ready. Dawson later described it as the longest 20 minutes of my life. One of them looked right at me. I thought he'd seen me. He just kept walking. The search ended. The VC force reformed and continued moving. The patrol exhaled. By mid-afternoon on February 23rd, they had been tracking for over 30 hours. They'd covered nearly 25 kilometers through enemy territory, following a force that had no idea they were being hunted. And finally, they found what intelligence needed: the VC base camp. It sat in a valley surrounded by dense jungle, invisible from the air. The patrol counted fighting positions, storage bunkers, and a headquarters complex. This wasn't a temporary camp. This was infrastructure. From their observation position on a ridge 200 meters away, signaller John Sparks Henderson began calling in coordinates. The airstrike that followed destroyed much of the base camp, killing an estimated 80 VC and forcing the battalion to relocate. But the greater impact was doctrinal. American commanders who had dismissed the Australian approach began paying attention. "We couldn't believe it," admitted Captain James Walker, U.S. Army liaison to the Australian task force. "5 guys did what we'd been trying to do with battalion-sized operations. They found the enemy, tracked them undetected, called in the coordinates, and got out clean. No friendly casualties. Total enemy surprise. It was revolutionary." The SAS refined their techniques throughout 1966-1967, developing what became known as ambush tactics. After tracking an enemy force to their base area, patrols would establish claymore mine ambushes along enemy supply routes. These ambushes were masterclasses in psychological warfare. "We'd hit them at dawn when they were half asleep," explained Sergeant Jim Ridley, who conducted over 40 ambush operations. 8 claymore mines detonating simultaneously, followed by 30 seconds of precision rifle fire, then silence. We'd be gone before they could react. From their perspective, they were being killed by ghosts. The VC and NVA forces in Phuoc Tuy adapted, though adaptation proved difficult against an enemy they couldn't find. They increased patrol sizes. The Australians just avoided larger patrols and tracked smaller ones. They set counter ambushes. The SAS studied these and adapted their routes. They tried to track the trackers, but the Australians were simply better at jungle craft. "We started finding documents on dead VC warning about the Australians," noted Captain Wade. "They called us the Phantoms. They knew we were out there, but couldn't figure out how to counter us. That psychological impact was worth more than body counts." American units began requesting SS assistance and training. Some U.S. Special Forces teams adopted similar techniques, though implementing the doctrine Army-wide proved impossible. The Australian approach required extensive training, smaller unit sizes, and a willingness to prioritize intelligence over immediate combat. Concepts that conflicted with American operational tempo and rotation policies. The most significant adaptation was the Australians' intelligence-driven targeting. Rather than random sweeps, every SAS patrol had specific intelligence objectives. Identify this supply cache, locate that headquarters, track this particular enemy unit. They built a comprehensive intelligence picture of enemy operations in Phuoc Tuy that far exceeded what American forces achieved in most provinces. "We knew the enemy's routines better than they did," boasted Lieutenant Ken Thompson. "We knew which trails they used, when they moved, where they camped. We could predict their movements because we'd been watching them for months." The Viet Cong responded with increasing paranoia. Documents captured later in the war showed that VC units in Phuoc Tuy faced standing orders to avoid certain areas, never stay in one location more than 2 nights, and maintain constant security. All because of SAS operations. The psychological impact was immeasurable. By 1967-1968, the Australian SAS squadron had conducted over 1,200 patrol days in enemy territory, engaged in 60-plus contacts, and suffered remarkably few casualties. 3 killed in action compared to an estimated 500-plus enemy KIA. Their intelligence provided targeting data for countless airstrikes and artillery missions. The statistics were staggering. SAS patrols achieved kill ratios exceeding 100.1 while operating in small teams deep in enemy territory. They found more enemy base camps, supply caches, and headquarters complexes than entire American divisions. Australian-controlled Phuoc Tuy province became one of the most secure provinces in South Vietnam, not through overwhelming force, but through relentless tracking and intelligence-driven operations. "We made the VC afraid to operate openly," explained Warrant Officer Harry Williams. "They knew that if they moved, we might be watching. If they camped, we might be calling in coordinates. That fear was our greatest weapon." Yet here lay the profound paradox. The Australian approach worked brilliantly at the tactical and operational level, but couldn't win the strategic war. Phuoc Tuy province was secured, but Vietnam as a whole was not. The SAS proved that patient, intelligent, small unit operations could dominate an insurgent enemy. But Australia only had 4,500 troops total in Vietnam. Scaling such operations across the entire country would have required the Americans to completely restructure their forces, training, and doctrine. "We showed them a better way, but they couldn't implement it," noted Colonel Thompson with a hint of frustration. The American military machine was built for conventional warfare. Divisions, corps, massive firepower. You can't just flip a switch and turn that into small unit counterinsurgency. The institutional inertia was too great. The Tet Offensive in January 1968 reinforced this paradox. In Phuoc Tuy province, Australian intelligence had tracked enemy preparations for weeks. When the offensive came, they were ready and defeated it quickly. In the rest of Vietnam, the Americans were caught by surprise. Tactical excellence in one province couldn't compensate for strategic failure across the country. Moreover, the Australian approach required something the Americans never had: time. SAS soldiers trained for years before deployment. They served longer tours and built institutional knowledge. American soldiers did one-year tours and left just as they'd mastered the environment. You can't teach junglecraft in 12 months. The last Australian combat troops left Vietnam in 1972, having lost 521 killed in action, proportionally far fewer than American losses. The SAS squadron returned home with its reputation enhanced. They had proven that insurgencies could be fought and won through intelligence, patience, and superior fieldcraft. "We didn't lose Vietnam," reflected Sergeant Condon decades later. "We just couldn't save it alone." The lessons from that 48-hour hunt in February 1966, and hundreds of patrols like it, influenced counterinsurgency doctrine for decades. British and Australian forces applied these tactics in later conflicts. American Special Operations Forces incorporated many techniques into their training. The fundamental principles: understand your enemy before you fight them, prioritize intelligence over firepower, accept that patience is a weapon, became counterinsurgency orthodoxy. Yet the broader lesson remains sobering. Tactical excellence cannot overcome strategic incoherence. The Australian SAS showed that a different way of fighting was possible and effective. They proved that small, highly trained units conducting intelligent operations could achieve far more than large formations blundering through the jungle. They demonstrated that in counterinsurgency warfare, the side that best understands the human terrain wins. But in the end, as Condon's patrol learned during that 48-hour hunt, you can stalk the enemy perfectly, strike with devastating precision, and still watched the war slip away, because the enemy's center of gravity wasn't on the battlefield at all. It was in the political will to outlast you. The rubber trees in Phuoc Tuy province still stand, silent witnesses to patrols that once moved through them like ghosts, hunting an enemy who never knew they were there until it was too late. 5 men against a battalion, patience against numbers, intelligence against ideology. The hunt they pioneered changed tactical warfare forever, even as the war itself was lost.